John Kennedy leaves the Five. In chaos, Jessica Tarlov storms off live. The studio lights of the Five burned bright, casting a warm glow over the polished table, where the panelists sat, their notes neatly arranged, their postures practiced. The audience, both in the studio and at home, buzzed with anticipation. The producers had teased a surprise guest all day, dropping cryptic hints on social media, but no one was prepared for what was about to unfold. The air crackled with expectation as the show's theme music faded, and Greg Gutfeld, with his trademark smirk, leaned into his mic. "Ladies and gentlemen, tonight's gonna be a wild ride. We've got a guest who doesn't just stir the pot, he flips it over. Please welcome Senator John Kennedy from Louisiana." The crowd erupted a mix of cheers and gasps as John Kennedy, the Republican senator known for his sharp wit and folksy charm, strode onto the set. His suit was crisp, his smile easy, but his eyes carried a glint of purpose, like a man who'd walked into a room knowing exactly what he was there to say. He took his seat, giving a nod to the panel: Greg, Dana Perino, Jesse Waters, and Jessica Tarlov, each of whom reacted in their own way. Greg chuckled, Dana adjusted her glasses, Jesse raised an eyebrow, and Jessica, arms crossed, fixed her gaze on Kennedy with a look that was equal parts curiosity and challenge. The energy shifted the room, tilting towards something unpredictable. This wasn't just another episode of The Five. This was about to become a moment no one would forget. Greg, ever the showman, kicked things off with a quip. "Senator Kennedy, you've got a knack for dropping one-liners that make headlines. Did you bring any for us today, or are you packing something heavier?" The audience laughed, but Kennedy's response was measured, his southern drawl cutting through the noise like a steady hand on a reins. "Greg, I didn't come here to throw zingers. I came to talk about something real, how we're talking to each other, or maybe how we're not." His words landed softly, but carried weight, and the studio quieted, sensing this wasn't going to be the usual back and forth. Dana, always the diplomat, leaned in. "Senator, you're known for your plain-spoken style, but some say that style can stir up division. What's your take on that?" Kennedy tilted his head, his smile faint but warm. "Dana, I think folks are tired of being talked at. They want someone to level with them, not lecture. If that stirs things up, maybe it's because the truth isn't always comfortable." The audience murmured, some nodding, others shifting in their seats. All eyes turned to Jessica Tarlov, who hadn't spoken yet but was clearly waiting for her moment. Her pen tapped lightly against Hero's system, her notes, her posture stiffening as if bracing for impact. She didn't wait for a prompt. "Senator Kennedy," she began, her voice sharp but controlled, "I respect your approach, but let's be honest. Your rhetoric, those memorable one-liners, often paint issues in black and white terms. Don't you think that can oversimplify complex problems and fuel division among people who are already polarized?" The studio went still, the weight of her words hanging in the air. It wasn't an attack, not exactly, but it was a challenge, one that cut to the core of Kennedy's public persona. He didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned back slightly, his hands folded, and considered her question with the same calm he'd walked in with. "Jessica, I don't aim to simplify anything. I aim to clarify. People aren't as fragile as some think they can handle straight talk. The problem isn't the words. It's when we stop listening to what's behind them." His response was steady, deliberate, and it shifted the room's dynamic. Greg raised an eyebrow, sensing the tension. Dana bit her lip, her notes momentarily forgotten. Jesse leaned forward, a grin tugging at his mouth, as if he could already see the viral clips this moment would produce. Jessica didn't back down. "But that's the issue, Senator. Your words carry weight. When you frame issues in ways that rally one side, It can make the other feel dismissed, even alienated. Doesn't that risk pushing people further apart? Kennedy's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger but in focus, as if he were sizing up the question like a chess move. If I'm speaking to one side, it's because I'm speaking to what I see as true. I don't get to control how it lands, but I'd rather say something honest and risk ruffling feathers than stay quiet to keep the peace. Silence doesn't solve division, it buries it. The audience stirred a low hum of approval mixing with murmurs of dissent. Jessica's jaw tightened, her pen pausing mid-tap. Honesty is one thing, she countered. But when your rhetoric energizes people to dig in their heels to see compromise as weakness, doesn't that make finding common ground harder? Kennedy's smile returned, just a touch, not mocking, but knowing. Common ground isn't found by dodging hard truths, Jessica. It's found by facing them head-on, even when it stings. The air thickened, the exchange electric, but restrained a far cry from the usual shouting matches. The camera cut to commercial, but the tension lingered, a promise that this was only the beginning. Back from the break, the panel tried to reset, but the undercurrent remained. Greg, sensing the need to lighten the mood, tossed out a question. "Senator, you've got a reputation for cutting through the noise. Is that why you're here, to shake things up?" Kennedy chuckled, the sound warm but edged with intent. "I'm here because people deserve to hear someone speak plainly, not just parrot talking points. If that shakes things up, so be it." Jessica jumped back in, her voice steady but firm. "Plain talk is powerful, but it can also be a blunt instrument. When you use it to call out one side, it can feel like you're dismissing the other's lived experience. That's not clarity. It's selective storytelling." Kennedy didn't miss a beat. "Every story's selective, Jessica. The trick is picking the parts that matter most. I choose the ones I think get us closer to solving problems, not just feeling good about them." The room felt smaller, the space between their words heavy with meaning. Dana tried to steer things gently. "Senator, do you think the way we talk about issues today on shows like this helps or hurts our ability to solve them?" Kennedy's gaze softened, but his voice stayed firm. "It helps if we're honest. It hurts if we're just performing. Most folks can tell the difference." Jessica's eyes narrowed, her notes untouched now. "But honesty isn't neutral, Senator. Your version of the truth often elevates one perspective. Rural, traditional, conservative, while sidelining others. Don't you think that risks leaving whole groups feeling unheard?" Kennedy leaned forward slightly, his tone steady but earnest. "I don't sideline anyone. I speak to what I know, to people I've met, to problems I've seen. If that feels one-sided, maybe it's because the conversation's been lopsided for too long." The studio went quiet, not from discomfort, but from the weight of his words. Greg tried to break the moment with a joke. "Well, Senator, you're definitely not here to make it boring." The audience laughed, but it was fleeting. Jessica's voice cut through again, measured but pointed. "You say you speak to what you know, but what about what you don't? The people who don't see themselves in your stories, who feel your rhetoric paints them as the problem." Kennedy's expression didn't change, but his eyes locked on hers. "I don't paint anyone as the problem. I paint the problem as the problem. If folks feel left out, maybe they're not listening close enough. Or maybe we're all listening to the wrong things." The exchange was no longer just a debate. It was a mirror held up to the audience, reflecting their own divisions, their own assumptions. Dana Ever, the peacemaker, tried again. "Isn't the challenge finding a way to speak truth without making people feel like they're on opposite sides of it?" Kennedy nodded, his voice softer now. "That's the goal, Dana. But truth isn't a group hug. It's a hard look in the mirror, and not everyone likes what they see. Jessica's pen resumed its tapping faster now, as if searching for a response. "That's exactly my point," she said, her voice rising just slightly. "Your truth, Senator, often feels like a judgment on people who see the world differently. When you frame issues as a fight between right and wrong, you're not inviting dialogue, you're drawing a line." Kennedy's smile faded not from anger, but from focus. "I don't draw lines, Jessica. People do that themselves. I just try to call it like I see it, and I trust folks to think for themselves about what it means." The room felt alive, every word landing like a spark. Jessie, who'd been quiet, finally chimed in. "But isn't that what makes this show work? We throw out ideas, let them clash, and trust the audience to sort it out." Kennedy nodded, a glint of approval in his eyes. "Exactly, Jessie. The problem isn't the clash. It's when we stop trusting people to handle it." Jessica shook her head, her voice low but resolute. "It's not about trust, Senator. It's about responsibility. When your words rally one group but push another away, you're not just sparking debate, you're shaping how people see each other." Kennedy looked at her, his gaze steady, almost searching. "And when we tiptoe around hard truths to avoid pushing anyone away, we're not shaping anything. We're just stalling." The tension was palpable now, not hostile but raw, like a wound exposed to air. Greg, sensing the moment, teetering, tried to pivot. "Okay, before we turn this into a philosophy seminar, let's talk about the media's role in all this. Senator, do you think shows like ours are helping or just adding to the noise?" Kennedy's laugh was soft, almost self-deprecating. "You folks do a bit of both. But the good ones like this show give people a chance to hear something real. Even if it's messy." Jessica's voice came back sharp, but not unkind. "Real for who? Though your real often feels like a story that leaves out half the country." Kennedy didn't flinch. "Then maybe that half needs to tell their story better, or listen harder to mine." The studio lights seemed to burn brighter, the air heavier with each exchange. Dana tried once more to smooth the edges. "Isn't the goal to find a way to tell everyone's story without shutting anyone out?" Kennedy's response was simple, almost gentle. "The goal is to tell the truth as best you can, and let the stories sort themselves out." Jessica's eyes flickered not with defeat, but with frustration, as if the conversation was slipping out of reach. "Truth isn't that simple," she said, her voice steady but strained. "Not when it's filtered through one lens, one perspective, one set of experiences." Kennedy looked at her, his expression unreadable but not dismissive. "Maybe not. But it's a start. And starting's better than standing still." The next question came from a producer's earpiece, read aloud by Greg with a smirk. "Senator, do you think the media's lost its nerve, afraid to say anything that might offend?" The audience chuckled, but Kennedy didn't. He leaned forward, his voice clear and deliberate. "The media hasn't lost its nerve. It's lost its focus. It's more about clicks than clarity, more about heat than light. But folks aren't as easily swayed as some think. They're hungry for something real, not just something loud." Jessica's eyebrow arched, her voice cutting in. "Real's fine, but when it's always your version of real, it starts to feel like a script, not a conversation." Kennedy's eyes met hers, steady and calm. "Then change the script, Jessica. You've got the mic. Use it." That line hit hard, not as a jab, but as a challenge. The audience leaned forward, sensing the shift. Jessica's hands stilled her notes, untouched, her gaze fixed somewhere beyond the set. "That's the problem," she said, her voice low but unwavering. "I'm trying to use it. but it feels like I'm shouting into a void where only one story gets heard. Kennedy's response was quiet, almost too quiet. Then maybe the void's not the problem. Maybe it's what we're shouting. The studio went silent, the weight of his words settling over the room like dust after a storm. Greg tried to laugh it off. Well, that's one way to drop the mic. But the levity fell flat. Jessica stood her movement deliberate, not dramatic, but unmistakable. "I came here for a real conversation," she said, her voice steady but sharp. "But all I'm hearing is the same story told the same way, with no room for anyone else's." Without another word, she walked off the set, her steps measured, controlled, but final. The studio froze. Dana stared at her notes, Jesse at his coffee cup, Greg at the empty chair. Kennedy didn't move, didn't react, just watched her go, his expression unchanged, but his silence louder than any retort. The audience, both in the room and at home, felt the ground shift. This wasn't a meltdown or a tantrum. It was a statement, a refusal to play by the rules of a conversation that felt rigged. And Kennedy, still seated, didn't gloat or chase the moment. He waited as if he knew the real discussion hadn't ended, it had only just begun. The camera lingered on the empty chair, the studio lights casting long shadows, and as the show cut to commercial, one thing was clear: this was no longer about a single debate. It was about something bigger, something that would echo far beyond the studio walls. The studio lights dimmed as the five cut to commercial, but the electricity from John Kennedy's clash with Jessica Tarlov lingered like static in the air. The audience, both in the studio and at home, sat stunned, their phones already buzzing with notifications, as clips of the exchange flooded social media. Within minutes, the hashtag #KennedyvsTarlov was trending, and the internet split into factions. Some praised Kennedy's calm, razor-sharp responses, calling him a voice of reason in a world of noise. Others rallied behind Tarlov, applauding her for standing her ground and walking off, rather than letting the conversation slide into a one-sided narrative. The moment Jessica's chair scraped back and she left the set deliberate and composed, it wasn't just a walk-off, it was a spark that ignited a firestorm of reactions. Newsrooms scrambled to package the moment for their evening segments, while viewers at home hit replay, dissecting every word, every glance, every pause. This wasn't just another day on the Five. This was a cultural moment, raw and unscripted, and the world was watching to see what would happen next. Back in the studio, the panel tried to regain its rhythm. Greg Gutfeld, never one to let silence linger too long, cracked a nervous joke. "Well, folks, that's one way to keep it real. Senator, you sure know how to shake up a Tuesday," the audience chuckled, but it was a thin laugh overshadowed by the weight of what had just happened. Dana Perino, her voice careful but steady, turned to Kennedy. Senator Jessica raised some strong points about the impact of rhetoric. How do you respond to her walking off like that? Kennedy, still seated with the same easy posture, took a moment before answering, his southern drawl softening the edges of his words. "I respect her for speaking her mind. Walking off doesn't mean she's wrong, it means she's done playing by someone else's rules. That's her truth, and I'm not here to judge it." His response was disarming, not defensive or triumphant, but measured as if he saw the bigger picture. Jesse Waters, leaning forward, pushed further. "But don't you think her leaving says something about where we're at? People can't even sit through a tough conversation anymore." Kennedy's eyes crinkled slightly, a hint of a smile. Jesse, people can handle tough conversations. They just need to feel like they're being heard, not preached at. That's where we keep tripping up. Outside the studio, the internet was a whirlwind. Clips of the exchange racked up millions of views within the hour. With one moment, Kennedy's quiet. Maybe the void's not the problem. Maybe it's what we're shouting, crossing 2 million shares alone. Comment sections erupted with polarized takes. One user wrote Kennedy just schooled Tarlov. That's how you stay cool under fire. Another countered, Jessica walked off because she's tired of old-school rhetoric drowning out real voices. Good for her. Blogs and news outlets jumped in with headlines ranging from measured to inflammatory. A major outlet ran Tarlov's exit, a stand or a surrender, while a conservative site blared Kennedy drops truth bombs. Tarlov can't handle it. But beneath the noise, something quieter was brewing. Ordinary viewers, not pundits or influencers, began sharing longer reflections. A teacher from Ohio posted, "I don't agree with Kennedy or Tarlov entirely, but I respect how they both stood their ground." When's the last time we saw that kind of honesty? A college student tweeted, "This wasn't just a fight, it was a mirror. We're all yelling past each other." These weren't the loudest voices, but they were the ones starting to resonate. Inside Fox News, the control room was a frenzy. Producers huddled around monitors, debating which clips to amplify on social media and how to frame the moment for the next show. Some wanted to lean into the drama, pushing Tarlov's storms off as the narrative. Others urged caution, recognizing that this wasn't just a viral moment, but a chance to spark something deeper. Legal teams reviewed footage, ensuring nothing crossed lines that could spark backlash. Meanwhile, Kennedy sat quietly in the green room sipping water, his phone untouched. He didn't check. Twitter didn't scroll through the headlines. He'd been through too many media storms to get caught up in one now. A staffer popped in asking if he wanted to respond to the online chatter. Kennedy shook his head, his voice low but firm. "Let folks talk. They'll figure out what matters." His calm was unshakable, not out of arrogance, but from a conviction that truth didn't need a megaphone to stand tall. Jessica, meanwhile, was in her dressing room, her phone buzzing relentlessly. Texts from friends poured in, some supportive, some worried, a few critical. Strangers flooded her mentions, some calling her brave, others accusing her of running from a fight. She didn't respond, not yet. Instead, she sat at a small table staring at a blank laptop screen, her mind replaying Kennedy's words. "Change the script. Jessica, you've got the mic. Use it." That line stung not because it was harsh, but because it challenged her to do more than react. She'd walked off not out of weakness, but out of frustration. A sense that the conversation was trapped in a loop, unable to move forward. Now alone with her thoughts, she began typing not a rebuttal or a defense, but something else. An essay, raw and unfiltered, about what it meant to speak in a world that often refused to listen. She titled it, "When Words Aren't Enough," and as her fingers moved across the keyboard, she felt a shift, not anger, but clarity. By evening, the story had spread far beyond the five. Cable news shows dissected the moment, with pundits on one channel praising Kennedy's restraint and others lauding Tarlov's principled stand. Online forums buzzed with debates, not just about who won, but about what the exchange revealed. A political analyst on a podcast summed it up. "This wasn't about Kennedy or Tarlov. It was about us. How do we talk about hard things without shutting each other out?" The comment struck a chord shared thousands of times. Meanwhile, Kennedy's office in Louisiana fielded calls from reporters, but he declined interviews, focusing instead on his next Senate meeting. His team, however, noticed a surge in messages from constituents not about policy, but about the show. One email read, "Senator, you said what I've been thinking for years. Keep being real." Another from a younger voter said, "I don't always agree with you, but I respect how you didn't back down or gloat. That's rare." Jessica's essay, still a work in progress, wasn't yet public, but she'd already decided to send it to Kennedy first. Not to prove a point, but to start something new, a conversation, not a confrontation. She didn't expect a response, but the act of writing it felt like reclaiming the mic Kennedy had challenged her to use. As she typed, she reflected on his composure, his refusal to escalate despite her pointed critiques. It wasn't that she agreed with him, far from it, but she couldn't deny the power of his approach, steady, unapologetic, yet open to hearing her out. That she realized was what had pushed her to leave the set, not defeat, but a need to find a better way to be heard. As the night wore on, the online frenzy showed no signs of slowing. A viral clip of Kennedy saying people can handle tough conversations, they just need to feel heard, became a rallying cry for those tired of performative debates. Another clip of Tarlov's walk-off was shared by those who saw it as a stand against entrenched perspectives. But the real story wasn't in the clips or the hashtags, it was in the quieter corners of the internet, where people began asking questions they hadn't asked before. Why was it so hard to talk without taking sides? Why did every disagreement feel like a battle? And could two people as different as Kennedy and Tarlov find a way to bridge the gap? Those questions, sparked by a single tense hour on the Five, were the real legacy of the moment, and they were only beginning to take root. The dust from the explosive episode of The Five had barely settled, but the ripples of John Kennedy's exchange with Jessica Tarlov were still spreading like waves from a stone dropped in still water. The internet churned with hot takes, memes, and endless replays of Tarlov's walk-off and Kennedy's unflappable responses, but away from the glare of studio lights and social media, something quieter was unfolding. Jessica Tarlov, still reeling from the intensity of the debate, had retreated to her apartment, her laptop open to the essay she'd begun in the aftermath, titled, "When Words Aren't Enough." It wasn't a rebuttal or a defense, but a raw, introspective piece about the limits of public discourse and the challenge of being heard in a world quick to judge. She'd poured hours into it, wrestling with her frustration, her admiration for Kennedy's composure, and her own decision to leave the set. When she finished, she made a choice that surprised even herself. She emailed the essay to John Kennedy. No introduction, no explanation, just the document attached, and a single line, "I wrote this because of our conversation." She didn't expect a reply, but the act of sending it felt like a step towards something new, a conversation that didn't need a stage or a camera to matter. In Louisiana, John Kennedy was far from the media frenzy, sitting in his Senate office, reviewing constituent letters and preparing for a committee meeting. His phone, as always, was silent, a deliberate choice to avoid the noise of the news cycle. When his aide handed him a tablet with Tarlov's email, he raised an eyebrow, intrigued but not surprised. He opened the essay and read it slowly, his expression unreadable but attentive. The piece was candid, even vulnerable. Tarlov wrote about the moment she walked off, not as a retreat, but as a refusal to let the conversation be reduced to sound bites. She acknowledged Kennedy's ability to command the room without raising his voice, but challenged the way his rhetoric, however honest, could overshadow other perspectives. "It's not about who's right," she wrote, "but about who gets to speak and who feels silenced. I left because I wanted to change the terms of the conversation, not end it." Kennedy read it twice, his fingers tapping lightly on the desk. Then, in his characteristic brevity, he typed a response, "Jessica, I read it twice. Thank you for writing it." No flourish, no grand gesture, just a nod across the divide, a signal that he'd heard her. The essay, published the next morning on a major op-ed platform, landed with unexpected weight. There were no sensational headlines or clickbait thumbnails, just Tarlov's words, unadorned and earnest. Readers accustomed to the usual cycle of outrage paused. The piece wasn't about winning or losing. It was about the space between where real understanding might begin. Tarlov admitted her own biases, her frustration with the format of shows like The Five, and her realization that Kennedy's restraint had forced her to confront her own impulse to push back harder. "He didn't shout, and that made me listen," she wrote. But listening doesn't mean agreeing, it means recognizing that the truth isn't owned by one side. The essay didn't shy away from her critique of Kennedy's approach, noting how his folksy clarity could feel like a shield deflecting the complexity of issues that didn't fit his narrative. Yet, it also gave credit where it was due. His refusal to play to the crowd had shifted something in her, a reminder that conviction didn't have to be loud to be powerful. The response online was unlike anything the viral clips had produced. Instead of the usual polarized shouting matches, readers shared the essay with comments like, "This is what we're missing, actual thought, instead of just reaction." A journalist tweeted Tarlov's piece isn't about Kennedy or the walk-off, it's about all of us and how we've forgotten how to talk. The essay crossed 1 million views by noon, not because it was inflammatory, but because it was rare a public figure reflecting openly without agenda on a moment that had seemed destined for division. Universities shared it in media studies classes. Community groups discussed it in book clubs. One reader, a retiree from Michigan, wrote, "I've watched The Five for years, but this is the first time I felt like someone was speaking to me, not at me." Tarlov's words had struck a nerve not by attacking Kennedy, but by inviting others to think about what they brought to the table in every conversation. Kennedy, true to form, didn't comment publicly on the essay. When a reporter called his office for a statement, his aide simply said, "The senator appreciated Ms. Tarlov's perspective and has no further comment." But behind closed doors, Kennedy's reaction was more telling. He shared the essay with a few close colleagues not to gloat, but to discuss its ideas. "She's got guts," he told a fellow senator over coffee. Didn't agree with all of it, but she's asking the right questions. His response to Tarlov, though brief, had been deliberate. A gesture of respect, not agreement. It was a small act, but in a world where public figures rarely acknowledged each other's humanity, it carried weight. Kennedy's team noticed a shift in the messages coming to his office. Constituents inspired by the exchange wrote not about policy, but about dialogue, asking how they could bridge gaps in their own communities. One letter from a small-town mayor read, "Senator, your calm on that show reminded me we don't have to yell to be heard. Thanks for showing us that." The broader impact of the moment began to take shape. Talk shows invited commentators to analyze Tarlov's essay not as a continuation of the drama, but as a starting point for discussing how public discourse could evolve. A podcast host remarked, "What Kennedy and Tarlov did without meaning to was show us that disagreement doesn't have to be a dead end. It can be a doorway." Social media, while still littered with partisan jabs, saw pockets of deeper conversation. A viral thread by a communications professor broke down the exchange, praising Kennedy for his restraint and Tarlov for her courage to step back and reflect. "This is what democracy looks like when it works," the professor wrote. "Not agreement, but engagement." The thread was shared thousands of times with replies ranging from heartfelt to skeptical. But the consensus was clear: something about this moment felt different. Tarlov, meanwhile, was navigating her own response to the essay's reception. She'd expected backlash, perhaps a few supportive messages, but not this, a groundswell of readers who saw her words as a call to rethink how they argued, listened, and engaged. She appeared on a morning show, not The Five, to discuss the piece, her tone measured, but passionate. "I didn't walk off to make a statement," she said. "I walked off because I needed space to think, not just react." Senator Kennedy's approach, whether I agree with it or not, made me realize we're all stuck in these cycles of talking past each other. When asked if she'd spoken to Kennedy, since she smiled faintly. We've exchanged words, but the real conversation is happening out there with all of you. Her words were met with nods from the host, a rare moment of agreement in a medium built on conflict. Back in Louisiana, Kennedy went about his work meeting with constituents and drafting legislation, but the exchange lingered in his mind. He didn't dwell on the viral clips or the headlines, but Tarlov's essay had left an impression. During a town hall, a voter asked him about the incident, not with the usual partisan edge, but with genuine curiosity. "Senator, how do you stay so calm when things get heated like that?" Kennedy chuckled, his drawl warm. "It's not about staying calm, it's about staying clear. You don't win hearts by shouting louder. You win them by listening better." The crowd nodded, and for a moment the room felt less like a political event and more like a conversation among neighbors. The private dialogue between Kennedy and Tarlov, sparked by her essay, and his response wasn't visible to the public, but its effects were. It had shifted the narrative from a clash of egos to a shared question: how do we talk to each other when we don't agree? The essay became a touchstone not for one side or the other, but for anyone tired of the endless cycle of outrage. Kennedy's restraint and Tarlov's reflection had, without intending to, created a blueprint for something better, a conversation that didn't end with a walk-off or a soundbite, but with a challenge to listen, think, and respond. As the day ended, Tarlov saved Kennedy's email, his simple words a reminder that even in disagreement there was room for respect. And Kennedy, looking over his schedule, felt a quiet satisfaction, not in winning the debate, but in knowing that somewhere someone was listening a little harder because of it. The viral storm that erupted after John Kennedy's clash with Jessica Tarlov on The Five had begun to quiet, but its impact lingered not in the fleeting noise of social media, but in the deeper currents of how people thought about discourse. The exchange marked by Tarlov's walk-off and Kennedy's unshakable calm had become more than a TV moment. It was a case study, a conversation starter, a challenge to a culture accustomed to shouting matches. Jessica Tarlov's essay, "When Words Aren't Enough," had struck a chord shared not for its drama, but for its call to pause and reflect. John Kennedy's brief, respectful response to her had set a tone that resonated far beyond the studio, turning a moment of tension into a lesson about listening. As the weeks passed, the story didn't fade into the usual cycle of outrage and amnesia. Instead, it took root, influencing classrooms, community discussions, and even the way people approached their daily conversations. This final chapter wasn't about who won or lost, it was about what was learned and what endured. In the months following the episode, the exchange between Kennedy and Tarlov became a reference point in unexpected places. Universities incorporated Tarlov's essay into media studies and political science curricula, using it to explore how public discourse could move beyond polarization. A professor at a small college in Virginia assigned it as required reading, telling her students, "This isn't about politics, it's about how we talk when we disagree." The class discussion wasn't heated or divided. Instead, students shared stories of their own struggles to communicate across divides, inspired by Tarlov's vulnerability and Kennedy's restraint. Community groups, from book clubs to civic organizations, began hosting forums inspired by the moment, asking questions like, "How do we listen without losing our voice?" One such event in a Chicago library drew a diverse crowd, where a retiree said, "I've been arguing with my brother for years about politics. Watching Kennedy and Tarlov made me realize we don't have to agree, we just have to hear each other." The moment had become a mirror, reflecting not just a single debate, but a broader yearning for connection in a fragmented world. Jessica Tarlov returned to the Five a week later, not to rehash the drama, but to continue her work with a subtle shift. Her commentary was as sharp as ever, but there was a new deliberateness to her words, a focus on asking questions rather than landing punches. During one segment, as the panel veered into a heated debate about a policy issue, Tarlov paused and said, "Can we step back and ask what we're really trying to solve here?" The room quieted, and Greg Gutfeld, usually quick with a quip, nodded. "That's a good one, Jessica." Viewers noticed the change with one tweeting, "Tarlov's not playing the same game anymore. She's raising the bar." Her essay had changed her not by softening her edge, but by sharpening her purpose. She began writing more publishing pieces that explored the intersections of media politics and human connection, each one building on the lesson she'd learned from Kennedy: conviction didn't need volume to be heard. Her audience grew not because she was louder, but because she was clearer, inviting others to think rather than react. John Kennedy, meanwhile, continued his work in the Senate, his focus unwavering despite the media spotlight. He didn't capitalize on the viral moment, declining interview requests and late-night show appearances. When a reporter asked about Tarlov's essay, he offered a simple, "She said what she needed to say, and I respect that." But his actions spoke louder than his words. At town halls across Louisiana, he began emphasizing listening as much as speaking, encouraging voters to share their stories before he offered his own perspective. "Folks don't need another lecture," he told a crowd in Baton Rouge. "They need someone to hear them out." His constituents responded with letters and emails praising his approach. One small business owner wrote Senator, "You showed me it's okay to stand firm and still be kind." That's what we need more of. Kennedy's calm, principled demeanor on the Five had cemented his reputation not as a showman, but as a steady voice in a noisy world, inspiring others to approach disagreements with the same clarity and respect. The broader impact of the moment extended beyond Kennedy and Tarlov. Media outlets, often criticized for fueling division, began to reflect on their role. A prominent news anchor, during a panel discussion, referenced the episode saying, "If a senator and a commentator can turn a fight into a conversation, maybe we can too." Podcasts dedicated episodes to dissecting the exchange, not for its drama, but for its potential to redefine discourse. One host noted Kennedy didn't try to win, he tried to be heard. Tarlov didn't walk away to quit, she walked away to rethink. That's what we're missing. The episode became a teaching tool with journalism schools, using it to explore the ethics of public debate. A Columbia University professor posed a midterm question. What does Tarlov's walk-off and Kennedy's response teach us about the power of restraint in communication? Students' answers varied, but the common thread was clear. The moment showed that disagreement could be a starting point, not an end point. The lesson of the exchange was simple, yet profound: listening, even in disagreement, builds bridges where shouting builds walls. This wasn't about erasing differences or pretending everyone could agree. It was about recognizing that every voice, even one you oppose, carries a truth worth hearing. For educators, the story became a way to teach students about empathy in debate. For communities, it was a reminder that conversations didn't have to end in anger. For individuals, it was a call to pause. Before reacting, to consider the other side not as an enemy, but as a perspective. One high school teacher in Texas shared the story with her debate club, saying Kennedy and Tarlov didn't solve the world's problems, but they showed us how to start. Listen first, then speak. Her students, usually quick to argue, began practicing a new rule before responding. Restate the other person's point to show you've heard it. The result was less shouting, more understanding, a small but tangible change. The legacy of the moment wasn't in headlines or viral clips, but in the quiet shifts it inspired. Tarlov's essay, now widely read, was translated into Spanish and shared in community centers, sparking discussions about how to talk across cultural divides. Kennedy's approach, rooted in clarity and respect, became a model for local leaders, from mayors to pastors, who saw in him a way to navigate tough conversations without losing sight of their values. The two never shared a stage again, but they didn't need to. Their exchange had planted a seed, one that grew in classrooms, living rooms, and town halls. It wasn't about agreement. It was about the courage to listen, the humility to reflect, and the strength to speak without needing to dominate. As the story faded from the news cycle, its lesson endured in a world quick to divide. The loudest act is often the quietest one. A pause, a question, a moment of respect. Kennedy and Tarlov, through their clash and their dialogue, had shown that even in disagreement, there was room for connection. For a society tired of endless arguments, that was a revolution worth learning from.